When I first arrived at the lodge, the cold mountain air didn't bite half as hard as the expression on my mother's face. The place was stunning, tucked into the Montana wilderness, surrounded by snow-dusted pines and jagged peaks that looked like they'd been carved with a scalpel. The kind of venue where the windows were so clean they looked invisible, where the smell of cedar and expensive soap hung in the air, where every hallway echoed like a cathedral. I'd been imagining this trip for months. Not because I was dying to be part of my sister's over-orchestrated, borderline royal wedding, but because for once, I thought I'd be treated like I mattered. I'd confirmed my room weeks ago. I'd even paid for it myself, pulling double shifts at the restaurant and barely sleeping between waiting tables and working on the manuscript I never told anyone about. And still, as I stood at the check-in desk clutching my duffel bag like it was the only part of my life I had control over, the front desk attendant smiled politely and told me there was no reservation under my name. I thought it had to be a mistake. Maybe a typo. Maybe the system glitched. I gave them my confirmation number, pulled up the email on my phone, showed them the receipt. The woman's smile dimmed just a little as she tapped again, then called over a manager. He was polite in a way that made me feel small. Explained that the room had been reassigned, his words, reassigned, as of that morning. I didn't understand. I kept repeating, but I paid for it. I booked it. I have the email. I'm the sister of the bride. And he just kept apologizing, kept offering to help me find other accommodations, as if I was some stranded tourist instead of family. The second I spotted my mother standing across the lobby in a navy blue pantsuit and perfectly pinned hair, talking to one of the groom's uncles, I marched straight to her. She didn't even flinch when I interrupted. Just turned slowly, like she'd expected this moment. Like I was the inconvenience. I asked her what was going on. Why was my room gone? Why was I being treated like some outsider? And she blinked at me, slow, sharp, calculating, and said, "We had to give that room to Mr. Whitmore. He flew in from Singapore and we needed to accommodate him near the others." I said, "But I had that room. You knew I was staying here." Her tone was clipped. "You'll have to find something off-site. I'm sure there's a motel in town. This weekend is bigger than just you, Claire. Please don't make a scene." I wanted to scream. To throw something. To ask her how she could look me in the eye and tell me that some business associate of the groom, someone I'd never met, someone who wasn't even family, mattered more than her own daughter. But I knew better. That wouldn't get me anywhere. It never had. My sister Danielle, the golden one, the one whose teeth had never been crooked, whose life was always unfolding on a stage with lighting designed just for her, hadn't even said anything to me yet. She was somewhere upstairs, surrounded by bridesmaids in matching robes, probably sipping champagne and talking about centerpieces. And I was here, being told, again, that I didn't count. That the girl who waited tables and scribbled short stories on receipt paper in the break room was just a placeholder. A detail easily brushed aside. Not glamorous enough, not accomplished enough, not useful enough. It wasn't about the room. Not really. It was about everything that came before it. The birthdays skipped. The phone calls not returned. The way my mother always introduced me to people as Claire, the creative one, with that smile that barely masked her disappointment. The way she praised Danielle's law degree like it was proof of her own success and spoke of my writing like it was a bad habit I hadn't grown out of. And now, here I was, 3 states away from home, standing in a 5-star lobby where I didn't belong, watching rich strangers in tailored coats stroll past me, laughing, sipping espresso, their luggage carried up by staff who wouldn't even glance in my direction. I didn't cry. Not then. I'd gotten good at holding things in. I just stood there, holding my bag, swallowing the kind of anger that makes your throat feel raw. I asked her, did Danielle know about this, and she just waved it off. Don't make this difficult. She has enough on her plate already. We didn't think you'd mind. They didn't think I'd mind. Because to them, I wasn't part of the picture. I was background noise. And when something inconvenient needs to be cleared from the frame, you just crop it out. I walked away before she could say anything else. I walked out of that lodge and into the icy wind, the cold slapping my face harder than any insult ever could. I didn't know where I was going. All I knew was that I wasn't staying there. Not where I was that disposable. Not where family meant hierarchy, not love. I don't think there was ever a time in my life when I didn't feel like an extra in someone else's story. Even as a kid, I knew my presence didn't carry weight, like I was just sort of there. Not the main event, not even a solid supporting role, just a placeholder. Someone useful when it was convenient, silent when it wasn't. Danielle was the star from the beginning. She had this shine to her, the kind that people notice in grocery store aisles and school lobbies and family functions where aunts clutch pearls and whisper things like, "She's going places." And she was. My mother made sure of it. After our father left when I was 11, just gone one morning, no note, no call, just the echo of his shoes on the front porch and the hollow ring of silence that followed, our house shifted around the empty space he left behind. My mother, who used to be soft around the edges, turned sharp. And she poured everything she had into Danielle like she was trying to sculpt a monument out of whatever was left of our family's name. Danielle was groomed, polished, coached. SAT tutors, tennis lessons, cotillion classes, internships at offices with tall glass windows and powerful men. Everything she did was a stepping stone towards some future where she'd be untouchable. Our mother didn't just cheer her on, she orchestrated every move like a general planning a flawless campaign. And me? I was useful. That's what I became. Not adored, not mentored, not even resented. Just functional. I was the one who carried boxes from the garage, who watched the dog when no one else could, who ran last-minute errands for gala events I was never invited to. I was 13 when I overheard my mother telling a neighbor that I was the low-maintenance one. Like I was a plant that didn't need watering. It wasn't just about chores or responsibilities. It was about silence. When Danielle made decisions, colleges, boyfriends, internships, there were family meetings, long talks at the dinner table, phone calls with relatives. When I got accepted into a creative writing summer program out of state, I had to find out on my own that we couldn't afford to send me, even though the tuition was covered. It was never spoken outright, but the message was always there: your life doesn't require discussion. You don't make waves. You adapt. I remember the first time I told my mother I wanted to be a writer. I was 9. I had filled an entire notebook with a story about a girl who could talk to animals, and I was so proud of it I handed it to her like it was a gift. She smiled, tight, distracted, and told me that was sweet, but maybe I should try something more practical. At 11, I wrote a story that won second place in a state competition. She framed Danielle's debate trophies, but mine sat in a drawer until it warped in the summer heat. By the time I was 15, I'd stopped showing her anything. Not out of anger, but because I learned to expect the blank look, the nod that meant nothing, the quiet dismissal of something I'd poured myself into. I was the daughter who didn't require spotlight, and that made me invisible. When relatives visited, they asked about Danielle's grades, Danielle's internships, Danielle's future. With me, they smiled politely and asked how school was going, then quickly moved on. My mother never corrected them, never redirected the attention. If anything, she leaned into it. Danielle was her triumph, her chance to prove that she could raise excellence out of abandonment and bitterness. I was the reminder of what got left behind. It hurt, but the kind of hurt that becomes so familiar you don't even realize it's pain anymore. It's just air. You learn to breathe around it. I never fought for more, because I didn't believe I was allowed to. I told people I liked being in the background, that I preferred quiet spaces and small groups and being alone. And in some ways that was true. But a bigger part of me had just resigned to the role I was given. I learned how to disappear in plain sight. I became the one who filled the space without demanding anything from it. Even in adulthood, nothing changed. Danielle went to law school, got her name engraved on business cards, dated men with corner offices and pedigrees. And I waited tables to keep the bills paid, scribbled story ideas between shifts, submitted pieces to journals that never replied. I didn't tell anyone when I got published for the first time. It was a tiny magazine with barely any reach, but it was mine. And when I finally mentioned it during dinner one weekend, my mother blinked, paused, and said, "That's nice, Claire," before turning to ask Danielle about her new apartment in Boston. There was no malice in it. That was the worst part. It wasn't hatred or cruelty, it was indifference. I wasn't seen enough to be hurt intentionally. I was just the girl who'd been conditioned to step aside, who filled grocery bags, picked up dry cleaning, took care of things without complaint. The kind of daughter who doesn't make a mess, who never asks to be chosen, who hears "not now" so often it stops sounding like rejection and starts sounding like normal. So no, it didn't surprise me when they gave away my room at the lodge without telling me. It didn't surprise me that no one apologized, that no one thought to check in. I wasn't surprised, I was used to it. Used to being the quiet one, the useful one, the invisible one. The girl no one notices until something's broken and someone needs to sweep up the mess. The room smelled like mildew and old detergent, and the heat barely worked. Every few minutes, the radiator hissed with effort, sputtering warmth that died before it could reach the edges of the space. The walls were painted a sickly off-white that made everything look grayer than it already was, and the bed creaked with even the slightest movement, its springs whining beneath the thin mattress. I sat curled up on the edge of it, arms wrapped around my knees, still wearing the same jeans and sweater I'd put on that morning before leaving for the lodge with some stupid sliver of hope that maybe, just maybe, this time things would be different. The hostel was 40 minutes away, tucked off a 2-lane road surrounded by nothing but skeletal trees and crusted snowbanks that hadn't melted in weeks. I found it through a last-minute search on my phone after wandering outside the lodge and realizing I had nowhere else to go. The girl at the front desk had given me a tired smile and a room key with a frayed plastic tag, and I'd walked down a narrow hallway lined with crooked light fixtures and doors with chipped paint until I found the one with my number on it. Room 11. The number looked like it had been scribbled onto the plaque by hand. I had one suitcase. Inside was the clearance rack dress I'd bought for the rehearsal dinner, steel blue, sleeveless, not quite the right size but passable under good lighting. There was also the leather-bound guest book my mother had asked me to bring, the one she hadn't mentioned again, as if I was just the designated courier for details that didn't matter. And my laptop. Always the laptop. Worn on the edges, stickers peeling off, keys faded from use. It was the only thing in the room that felt like mine in a real way, not just because I owned it, but because it held everything I wasn't allowed to be out loud. I didn't cry right away. I sat there for a long time staring at the cracked window, the frost spreading across the glass like veins under skin. I could see the glow of the town in the distance, distant lights blurred by the cold, and I imagined the lodge still buzzing with wedding energy, champagne popping, shoes clicking against marble floors, people laughing in soft candlelight. Danielle was probably in the center of it, surrounded by people who adored her, who saw her, who never doubted for a second that she belonged. And I was here, sitting on a bed that smelled faintly of bleach and something older, my fingers curled tightly into the cuffs of my sleeves, my throat sore from keeping everything inside. I thought about every time I'd told myself it didn't matter. Every moment I'd excused the things they said, or didn't say. The holidays where my name was an afterthought. The birthdays that passed with a generic card, no call. The years I tried to measure up in silence, hoping that if I worked hard enough, waited long enough, kept being useful and polite and small, someone would finally notice. That they would finally say it, "We're proud of you, too." But it never came. I was always the one expected to understand. To be patient. To forgive without being asked. Danielle had pressure, I had invisibility. And I wore it like armor, even when it rubbed me raw. I told myself they didn't mean to hurt me, that I was just different, that I shouldn't want the same kind of attention, that needing it made me weak. But sitting there, in that freezing room where the light buzzed like a dying fly and the air was thick with the weight of being forgotten, I felt something shift. Not in a loud, dramatic way. It was small. Quiet. A crack, not a collapse. But real. For the first time, I didn't want to make it okay. I didn't want to pretend it didn't hurt. I didn't want to excuse the way my mother looked past me, or the way Danielle never noticed when I wasn't there, or how I was always the one standing at the edge of the photo, never centered. I didn't want to keep showing up just to be ignored. I didn't want to keep shrinking myself so others could take up space. I didn't want to keep believing that if I just worked harder, loved more quietly, waited more patiently, they'd finally make room for me. I sat there for a long time, the radiator still clicking uselessly in the corner, my breath visible in the air. The guest book sat unopened at the edge of the bed. My laptop was still in my lap, the screen casting a faint glow across my knees. I opened a new document. The cursor blinked against the empty white space, patient and waiting. And for once, I wasn't afraid of what I was about to write. The music was already thumping by the time I arrived, muffled behind the lodge's thick glass doors and echoing across the snow-covered driveway like a heartbeat I wasn't part of. I stood outside for a few moments longer than necessary, my hands wrapped around the thin clutch I'd borrowed from a coworker, my clearance dress clinging to my legs in the cold wind, my breath visible in the air as I reminded myself this would be over soon. Inside, everything glittered. Gold-toned lighting bathed the room in a soft, expensive warmth, and every corner was carefully staged, floral arrangements taller than me, white linens so crisp they looked starched by hand, and guests dressed in gowns and tuxedos as if they were auditioning for a royal court. No one noticed me when I walked in. Or if they did, they looked through me like I was part of the wall. I spotted my mother near the main table, her posture perfectly upright, drink in hand, laughing too loudly at something a man in a velvet blazer said. She didn't turn to see me, didn't glance my way, didn't acknowledge the fact that I'd managed to make it here at all. Danielle stood nearby, radiant in her custom gown, hair swept into an immaculate chignon, surrounded by a cluster of guests and bridal party members who orbited her like planets around a sun. I stood there alone until a woman with a headset approached me, scanning the clipboard in her hand, asking my name. When I told her, she nodded, barely meeting my eye, and gestured vaguely to the far end of the hall. Table 18. It was positioned near the swinging doors of the kitchen, half hidden behind a structural beam. Every time the staff pushed through, trays clattered and hot steam spilled out, disrupting the illusion of elegance that blanketed the rest of the room. The table was already half full, an elderly cousin I hadn't seen since I was 12, 2 people I didn't recognize, and a man who spent the entire evening talking on his Bluetooth earpiece. No name card with my last name. No welcome. Just a chair pulled half out, the implication clear. Someone remembered me at the last second. I watched as the photographer moved through the space, capturing the curated smiles of a family that no longer included me. They gathered by the fireplace for the immediate family photos, someone calling out names with authority, directing people like pieces on a chessboard. Danielle posed beside our mother and her new in-laws, the train of her gown spread perfectly behind her, her smile tight but photogenic. I waited for someone to call me over. No one did. At some point, I caught Danielle's eye. Just for a second. Her gaze flicked over me like a passing thought, no smile, no recognition, and then she turned her head back toward her husband, lifting a champagne flute with a toast I wasn't part of. The night blurred after that. I ate the salad in front of me out of obligation and picked at the overcooked chicken breast that followed. No one spoke to me. Conversations drifted around the table without ever including my name. Every toast mentioned Danielle's beauty, her accomplishments, the bright future ahead. No one mentioned the sister who used to wait up for her after dates, or drive her to early morning swim practices, or iron her clothes when she was too tired to care. That version of me didn't exist in this room. I was tolerated, not invited. Present, not welcomed. It was during the cake cutting, when the crowd had moved closer to the main table with their phones out, that I met Julian. He was carrying a tray of champagne glasses, weaving through guests with practiced ease. He must have noticed me hovering by the edge, half in shadow, holding an untouched glass of sparkling water. He stopped just long enough to say something I barely caught over the noise. "You okay?" I nodded too quickly, embarrassed, unsure how to answer. I was fine, of course I was fine, wasn't I always? But he didn't walk away. He stood there, quiet for a second, then said, "You don't look like them." I laughed, a dry sound I hadn't meant to let out, and said, "That's because I'm not." There was something about the way he looked at me, steadily, without judgment, without pity, that loosened something in my chest. I don't even remember what I told him exactly, but it spilled out in pieces. That I was the sister. That no one really noticed me. That I wasn't supposed to be here, not really. He listened without interruption, his tray now resting on the corner of a side table. When I paused, feeling suddenly stupid for saying too much, he shrugged and said, "Sounds like they're missing out." Then, after a beat, he added, "Your stories, if they're anything like what you just told me, might change someone's life." I didn't know what to say to that. No one had ever said anything like that to me before, not without an agenda, not without following it up with a laugh or a condescending pat on the arm. He meant it. That much I could tell. And somehow, in that moment, it meant more than any toast I hadn't received or photo I'd been left out of. I didn't stay long after that. I slipped out before the dancing started, unnoticed by anyone at my table or in my family. The cold hit my face as I stepped outside, but it didn't sting the way it had the night before. It was sharp, clear, real. I drove back to the hostel with numb fingers and a buzzing in my chest I couldn't explain. When I reached my room, I didn't even take off my shoes. I opened my laptop, the screen flickering softly in the dim light, and let my fingers move. The words came in a rush, not perfect but true. All night, I wrote. Not for them, not for validation, not to be seen. Just to finally say what had been buried inside me for years. The bus station smelled like wet concrete and burned coffee, and my backpack felt heavier than it should have, not because of the weight of what was inside, but because of everything I was carrying that no one could see. I stood in line behind a woman humming softly to herself and a man arguing with someone through a cracked phone screen, and when I stepped up to the counter and asked for a one-way ticket to Seattle, the clerk didn't even blink. He just printed it out, slid it across the scratched plastic surface, and said, "Next." That was it. No questions, no ceremony. I walked to the terminal with $400 in my bank account, no forwarding address, and no plan beyond leaving. I didn't tell anyone. Not my mother, not Danielle, not the cousin I shared a table with at the reception, not even the few friends who still texted me once every few months just to check in. It felt like slipping out of the back of a room where no one had noticed I entered in the first place. No dramatic goodbye, no confrontation, no scene. I just disappeared, like a line erased from a page, and no one turned the paper over to see where it had gone. It took 3 days before anyone realized I was gone, and I only knew that because someone from the lodge called to ask if I'd forgotten the guest book. Not because they missed me, not because they were worried, but because they were cleaning up and needed to return the leftovers. I told them to keep it, then hung up before I could hear the confusion in their voice. That silence on the other end of the line, that sudden stillness when someone realizes they don't matter to you in the way they thought, was strangely satisfying. And that was the last thing that tied me to Montana. Seattle was wet and loud and indifferent, which was exactly what I needed. The city didn't care who I was or where I'd come from. I found a room above a laundromat in a neighborhood that always smelled like dryer sheets and spilled beer. The walls were thin, the ceiling sloped, and the window had a crack running diagonally across the glass like a jagged scar, but it was mine. I got 2 jobs the same week. One at a greasy spoon diner that opened at 5 a.m., where I poured burnt coffee into chipped mugs for construction workers and hungover students. The other at a bookstore cafe that paid almost nothing but let me take home day-old pastries and whatever books were too damaged to sell. My days were long and exhausting. I fell asleep most nights still in my clothes, my limbs aching, my fingers raw from scrubbing dishes and lifting crates of onions and wiping down counters. But the city wrapped around me like a blanket stitched from strangers' noise and headlights on wet asphalt and the distant rattle of buses at midnight. It didn't pretend to know me. It didn't demand anything. And that gave me space I'd never had before. At night, after my shift at the cafe, I stayed behind when they locked the doors. The owner, a soft-spoken woman with a sleeve of tattoos and hair that changed color every month, hosted open mic nights in the back room of the shop. They weren't glamorous, just a mic stand, a rug, a few folding chairs, and some candles and empty wine bottles, but people came. Locals, weirdos, dreamers, the kind of people who felt too much and talked too loud and scribbled things onto napkins in the middle of meals. They brought poems and stories and songs, some brilliant, some messy, all honest. I sat in the back for weeks, never speaking, just listening. I watched people shake as they read, watched them choke on their own words, laugh at their own lines, cry and keep going. It scared me. It lit something up inside me that I didn't know what to do with. And then one night, Gabriella stood in front of the mic, hair wild, boots scuffed, and read a poem about her mother forgetting her birthday. Every word sliced through me like something too familiar to ignore. After the applause, she walked past me and said, "You should read something next week." I hadn't told her I was a writer. I hadn't said a word to her before that night. But she saw it. Somehow, she knew. The next week, I printed out the first chapter of the novel I'd been working on since I was 19. The file had lived on my laptop for years, growing in quiet, stunted pieces while I worked shifts and got passed over and tried not to want more than I was given. I stood behind the mic with the pages shaking in my hands, my mouth so dry I thought I wouldn't get a single word out. But I did. I read slowly, tripping once or twice, my voice cracking halfway through a sentence about a girl who runs away in the middle of the night and writes letters she never sends. The room was silent. Not out of politeness, but attention. People were listening. And when I finished, there was this pause, brief, breathless, before someone clapped. Then another. Then the whole room. Afterward, Gabriella hugged me. No big speech, no flattery. Just a tight squeeze and a whisper in my ear, "See? It was already in you." I walked home in the rain, my sneakers soaked through, my printout curled with water and fingerprints. But something in me felt dry and lit and alive in a way I'd never known. That chapter had always been part of me, just waiting for the moment I stopped asking permission to speak. It was a Thursday, the kind of gray Seattle evening where the sky looked like wet wool and the rain came down in sheets so fine you didn't notice how soaked you were until you stopped moving. I almost didn't go to the reading that night. My shift at the diner had run long, I was exhausted, my shoes were still damp from the morning storm, and the stack of dishes in the bookstore cafe had pushed everything back. But something in me pulled toward that back room anyway, toward the folding chairs and the mismatched cushions, toward the people who clapped like it meant something. I didn't plan to read that night, I just wanted to sit quietly, to be in the noise without having to contribute to it. I slipped into my usual spot near the corner, nursing a lukewarm cup of tea, my notebook resting on my lap like a shield. The room filled slowly. A guy with dreadlocks read a piece about his grandmother's tattoos, someone else recited a love letter to a bus driver, and then Gabriella called my name. I hesitated. I hadn't prepared anything new, but I felt the weight of her gaze, calm and certain, and so I stood. I pulled the folded printout of a chapter I'd edited on my lunch break and walked up to the mic. My hands weren't shaking this time. My voice held steady. The chapter was about a girl who learns to live in quiet places, who collects silence like souvenirs, who writes in secret because the world only listens when it's ready, not when she is. I read slowly, pacing each sentence with care, letting the air breathe between the lines. When I finished, the room was still. Then the clapping came, louder than usual, not rushed or obligatory. But what caught me off guard was the man who approached me afterward, tall, maybe late 40s, dressed in dark layers that looked more tailored than the usual thrift store Seattle uniform. His eyes were kind but intense, like he was cataloging everything about me without making me feel exposed. He introduced himself simply, Alexander. Said he was visiting friends in town and had heard about the readings through someone at the university. I nodded politely, ready to thank him and move on, but then he said my pen name. My pen name. The one I'd used on a dozen short stories published in corners of the internet where I thought no one I knew would ever find me. The one I never said out loud. He said it like it was familiar. Like it mattered. I've been following your work for 3 years, he said, voice calm, deliberate, almost too casual for what he was saying. You have something I rarely see, clarity without pretense. Emotion without performance. I run a press, Monarch House, and I want to publish your work. I stared at him like he'd spoken in another language. I laughed, a reflex, awkward and small, because things like that didn't happen to people like me. But he didn't laugh. He waited. He handed me a card, heavy, textured paper with his name embossed cleanly in silver, and told me to think about it, to reach out when I was ready, that there was no rush. Then he nodded once and left, like he hadn't just cracked something wide open. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on the floor of my room, surrounded by pages I'd written and forgotten about, stories I'd never shown anyone, pieces I assumed would never be anything more than digital dust. I Googled him. Monarch House was real, respected, even. Their books weren't the flashy ones stacked near the front of chain stores, but the ones you found in quiet shops, on shelves curated by people who still believed in literature. When I finally called him, I expected doubt to creep in, expected the hesitation to choke me out. But he picked up on the second ring, said, Claire, like he'd been waiting. And everything after that felt like stepping into the version of myself I'd written about but never believed I could become. He didn't just want to publish me, he wanted to understand the shape of my voice, the rhythm of my sentences, the parts of me I'd been told were too quiet to matter. He read everything. Every word, every draft. He asked questions no one had ever asked me. Why this metaphor? Why this silence here? What were you afraid of when you wrote this? I'd never had anyone handle my work like it was sacred before. Like it deserved time. Like it deserved him. Over time, it became more than emails and edits. He remembered the name of the waitress who screamed at me during a brunch shift and asked how my bruised wrist was healing after I slipped on the diner floor. He noticed when my voice sounded tired over the phone and reminded me to rest. He mailed me books with notes in the margins, poems folded into envelopes, tiny gifts that felt like parts of himself wrapped up in paper and ink. He saw me. In a way no one in my life ever had. Not like the ghost they tolerated at family holidays. Not like the background character with a service job and a hobby no one took seriously. He saw the full weight of me. And for the first time in my life, I felt brilliant. Not just good. Not just talented in that patronizing way people use when they want to be kind. Brilliant. As in undeniable. As in I belonged in rooms with microphones and bookshelves and contracts. As in I didn't have to shrink. I walked differently after that. Wrote differently. Lived differently. Because somewhere in that rainy city, after so many years of being overlooked, someone finally chose to look at me and didn't look away. The photo that broke the news wasn't even staged. We were standing outside a bookstore in San Francisco after a panel, me still holding a Sharpie from the signing, Alexander's hand resting lightly at the small of my back, both of us laughing about something no one else would have understood. I didn't even see the camera. But by morning, it was everywhere. My name, my pen name, and the headline I never thought I'd see, best-selling author Claire M. Ellis engaged to Monarch House founder. It spread like wildfire, across literary blogs, publishing circles, and then, somehow, to tabloids that had no business knowing who I was. I didn't think about my family when I saw it. Not at first. I was too caught in the strange, dizzying quiet of realizing that something I built, something I fought for in secret, had become bigger than me. My name, my real name, was on books that sat in storefront windows. My face was on posters I hadn't approved. And the story I wrote in a freezing hostel room was now being quoted in reviews that used words like luminous, visceral, urgent. But the call came anyway. I hadn't changed my number. I don't know why. Some part of me must have believed they wouldn't care enough to use it. I was in the middle of making tea when the phone rang, and I almost didn't pick up. But I saw the name Mom and something in me, maybe old habit or the sheer absurdity of the moment, made me answer. Her voice came through sharp, clipped, the way it always was when she was pretending not to be furious. Claire. What is this? No greeting. No congratulations. No warmth. Just the accusation, already loaded in her throat. I didn't ask what she meant. I just waited. She exhaled like I'd offended her, like the sound of my silence was impolite. Is it true? You're engaged? To that man from the article? You're getting married and you didn't think to tell your family? My tea kettle began to whistle behind me, but I didn't move. I stood barefoot in our kitchen, surrounded by shelves lined with books that had my name on the spine, and realized I felt nothing. Not anger. Not fear. Not even the bone-deep shame that used to hum under my skin whenever she spoke to me like this. Just stillness. Yes, I said. Calm. Measured. It's true. She launched into the kind of monologue I'd heard 100 times growing up. The one where she played victim and matriarch in equal measure. She said it was a betrayal, that family came first, that I was being disrespectful. She said Danielle had seen the news, and she was hurt. That I owed it to them to include them. That it didn't matter how distant things had become, blood was blood. She used that word like it was a leash. Like it meant I was still theirs to summon. She demanded to know when the wedding was, where it would be held, how many invitations we were sending, how many they should expect. I let her speak. Not because I was afraid. But because I knew this was the last time I would ever have to listen. When she finally stopped, I could hear the tight, hissing sound of her breath through the phone. I picked up the kettle, poured the water slowly, and then said, "You're not invited." She went silent. The pause wasn't long, but it was loud. "Excuse me," she snapped. "You heard me," I said. "You're not invited. None of you are." The words didn't come from spite. They weren't designed to hurt. They came from truth. And for once, I didn't soften them to make someone else comfortable. I didn't twist myself to fit the shape of her expectations. I didn't apologize for drawing a line. "I'm not doing this anymore," I continued, still holding the phone to my ear, staring at the steam rising from my mug. "I'm not pretending. I'm not shrinking. I'm not carving out pieces of myself to fit into the space you allowed me to occupy. I spent most of my life being the invisible one. The burden. The quiet girl who didn't cause trouble because she knew she wasn't wanted. And you all taught me, very early, that your love had conditions. That I had to earn it. That being seen was something I had to prove I deserved. I could feel my heart beating, but my voice didn't waver. But I don't need it anymore. Not from you. I have a life now. One I built without your help. One that means something to people who actually see me. I'm getting married to a man who listens when I speak, who reads what I write like it matters, who never once made me feel like I was too much or not enough. I have readers who cry when they finish my stories because they feel understood. I have friends who cheer when I walk into a room. And I did all of it without you. She started to speak, but I didn't let her. I'm not angry, I said, softly now. I'm just done. I'm done apologizing for existing. I hung up. I didn't wait for her reply. I didn't feel the need to justify myself, or to comfort the silence she left behind. I placed my phone on the counter and sat at the kitchen table, wrapped my hands around the warm mug, and stared out the window where the rain had begun to fall again, slow and steady against the glass. In another life, a younger version of me would have imagined that moment for years, rehearsed the words, carried them around like a secret talisman to be used in some distant fantasy. But the truth was, when it finally came, it wasn't dramatic or explosive. It was quiet. Certain. And it was mine. Planning the wedding was nothing like I thought it would be. There were no color-coded binders, no passive-aggressive debates over place settings or cake flavors, no arguments about seating charts that balanced obligation over affection. Instead, there was laughter, quiet joy, and a calm I'd never associated with the word wedding. Every name on our guest list was there because they mattered, not because they shared my blood, not because of some unspoken social expectation, but because they had shown up for me in real ways, in the dark, in the quiet. In the years when I was nothing to most people except a girl with a notebook and a job that made her invisible. The list grew slowly at first. Gabriella, who had stood by me when my voice was still tentative and small. Julian, who saw me on a night when my own family didn't. My editor, who fought for my words like they were her own. Alexander's sister, who sent me handwritten notes after every event I survived, filled with words like brilliant and more than enough. Friends from the bookstore cafe. Artists, baristas, poets, servers, line cooks, readers. People who saw the real shape of me long before the world decided I was someone worth publishing. Not a single member of my biological family was invited. That decision wasn't something I labored over. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't even emotional. It was a clear, clean choice, the same kind of choice I'd watched them make over and over again when it came to me. They had spent years showing me what place I held in their world. This was simply the first time I had the authority to return the favor. But silence, as I learned, is a language they don't tolerate well. My mother was the first to break. She called Alexander's office twice in the same week, under the guise of congratulating him on our engagement. She left messages that were cloying and brittle, her voice stretched thin with forced warmth. She called me my daughter Claire, as if the phrase might smooth over everything she'd never said when it mattered. The receptionist flagged it immediately. She never got through. Then came the letters. Not from my mother, she was far too proud to write, but from Danielle. 5 in total. Handwritten in her looping, elegant script, the kind she used when she wanted to be taken seriously. Every line carefully crafted, every paragraph polished like a speech. Not once did she apologize. Not for the room she let be taken from me. Not for the years of silence. Not for the wedding where she couldn't even look me in the eye. Instead, she used words like misunderstanding and regret, dressed up with nostalgia, peppered with passive guilt. You've always been my sister, she wrote in one. I hope you remember the good times. As if memory could outweigh pain. As if closeness as children erased abandonment as adults. Every envelope was scented, expensive, almost theatrical. She wanted reconciliation, but only on her terms. With me quiet. With me grateful. Then Preston stepped in. He sent a message through my publicist, of all people, something so tone-deaf it bordered on parody. A polished, professional email that read more like a PR memo than anything personal. He spoke of family optics, public narratives, repairing perception. He called it a chance to heal and showcase unity. As if my life was a press release. As if his concern was about the headlines, not the wounds. Not once did he ask what I needed. Not once did he acknowledge what they'd done. His version of resolution was a photo op. I didn't reply. I didn't reply to any of them. Because I had nothing left to say. I had spent most of my life trying to translate myself into a language my family could understand. I had twisted myself into silence, carved myself into usefulness, swallowed pain in the hope that one day, it might be exchanged for love. But love doesn't come with caveats. And peace doesn't live in the hands of people who only extend them when they need something. I found peace when I stopped asking to be chosen. When I stood in that fitting room, wearing a dress I picked out for myself, surrounded by women who knew every version of me, not just the polished one, not just the public one, I didn't think about who wasn't there. I thought about every night I'd written in the dark, every morning I'd gone to work with fingers raw from typing, every small act of defiance that built the life they never believed I could have. I didn't need their approval. I had something better. I had my own voice. My own name. My own joy. And no one, especially not them, had earned the right to touch it. The morning of my wedding began in stillness, the kind of quiet that feels deliberate, like the world is holding its breath in reverence. The light filtered through the windows in soft golden streaks, warming the edges of the room where Gabriella was already fussing over something in the corner, her voice a low hum of excitement. I sat in front of a mirror framed in ivy, not staring at my reflection, but letting the moment settle around me, gentle, real, earned. The dress was simple, elegant, nothing extravagant, but it wrapped around me like it knew the shape of who I had become. Every stitch felt like a thread pulled from the version of myself I'd fought to reclaim, a version stitched together through pages, silence, resilience, and finally, truth. There was no performance, no show. Just people I loved. People who had seen me when I didn't know how to be visible. Julian arrived early, camera slung across his chest, his grin wide and familiar. He hugged me like we were still in that candlelit reception hall where I had first spoken aloud what I hadn't yet believed about myself. Gabriella never left my side, her eyes lined with eyeliner she pretended wasn't smudging from tears. She kept whispering things like, "This is the chapter where everything turns," and "You made it, babe," in between bites of the croissant she insisted on eating in my dressing room. She was everything I never knew I needed, steady, vibrant, mine. The ceremony was held in a garden just beyond a historic house overlooking the bay. The air smelled like salt and blooming jasmine. The guests weren't dressed for spectacle, they were dressed for sincerity. My editor sat in the front row, next to two librarians who had organized my first reading tour. Behind them were faces I recognized from signings, emails, quiet conversations at bookstore counters. They were readers, mentors, people who had held space for my voice long before it had been amplified. And at the end of the aisle stood Alexander. He didn't try to hide the tears. His eyes were wet the second I stepped into view, and he didn't blink them away. He looked at me like I was the answer to a question he hadn't dared ask out loud, and I met that gaze with all the certainty I used to think I'd never deserve. Every step I took toward him felt like stepping out of the shadow of who I'd been asked to be. I didn't shake. I didn't second guess. I walked forward, not toward validation, but toward a life I had built from the bones up. When we spoke our vows, we didn't quote poetry or make grand declarations. We told the truth. About the loneliness before we found each other. About the hunger for a kind of love that didn't ask us to change, didn't ask us to shrink. About how hard it was to believe in forever when your past has always been temporary. And how choosing each other wasn't about filling a void, but about building something where nothing had existed before. The applause afterward was real, not rehearsed. And when Gabriella raised her glass during the reception and shouted, "To the girl who stopped asking to be loved the wrong way," I didn't look away. I stood there in the center of it, not as a symbol, not as someone redeemed, but as someone fully claimed, by myself, first, and then by those who saw the real version of me and never once flinched. It wasn't until hours later that I heard about what had happened. One of the venue managers pulled me aside gently, her tone cautious, her expression more apologetic than necessary. She said 2 women had attempted to enter the grounds, uninvited, unannounced. One of them had a familiar tone, insistent and sharp, demanding entry. The other stood back, saying nothing. When they were turned away, firmly, without incident, they didn't argue. They left. Quickly. Quietly. I didn't ask for details. I knew who they were. I didn't feel satisfaction. No surge of triumph, no fantasy of confrontation fulfilled. Just a quiet understanding that the chapter had closed, and I hadn't needed to slam the door. I didn't picture their faces, didn't wonder what they thought as they stood outside the walls of something they never tried to help me build. I didn't need to. Because they weren't part of this. Not the vow, not the joy, not the life that had grown from ashes they once scattered like dust. What I felt wasn't revenge. It was peace. A peace so deep, it softened the edges of every scar I'd ever hidden. A piece so whole, it made silence feel like a blessing. A piece I had written for myself, word by word, truth by truth. And on that day, surrounded by the family I chose, I finally stepped fully into the story I had always deserved to live. It started as a whisper, one of those fake social media posts that hints at disaster without saying anything outright, the kind of thing you scroll past without meaning to look twice, until a name catches your eye. I hadn't searched Danielle's in months, hadn't thought about her face or voice or the perfume she used to wear that gave me migraines. But there it was, tucked beneath a headline I couldn't ignore, prominent developer Preston Calloway indicted for multi-million-dollar fraud scheme. The details were surreal. Wire fraud, shell companies, fabricated contracts, investors defrauded out of homes that never existed. A sprawling, gleaming empire of glass and steel built on sand. He was sentenced quickly, his plea deal reduced by the amount he'd been able to return, but it wasn't enough. Not for the families. Not for the partners who trusted him. Not for the version of prestige Danielle had wrapped herself in like armor. I didn't reach out. I didn't call, didn't text, didn't send a polite note or a cold line of curiosity. I simply read the articles the way I would any other scandal, distanced, quiet, unsurprised. The most jarring part was how little it shook me. How little space it took up inside me. I watched the unraveling through headlines and whispered anecdotes passed along by acquaintances who still lingered in both our orbits, people who couldn't resist sharing details with a sort of reverent pity, like they were offering me a piece of victory. But it never felt like a prize. It just felt like what happens when the mask finally slides off. Danielle lost everything. The luxury apartment, the curated life, the invitations to things that only existed for those who belonged. The real estate license. The clout. Her name became something whispered instead of applauded. Articles stopped referring to her as community leader and instead attached her only to him, Preston Calloway's wife. And then just his ex-wife. Her fall wasn't loud, but it was complete. I heard our mother sold the house. The same house Danielle had once called her legacy. The house with the photographs I was never in, the rooms I was only ever asked to clean. It had been mortgaged to cover Preston's debts, piece by piece, until the foundation gave out. She moved in with a cousin 3 towns over, someone who hadn't spoken to me since I was 16. It was almost poetic, but I didn't linger on the symmetry. Because the truth was, I didn't care. Not in the way people wanted me to. Not in the way that would have given any of it power. I didn't need Danielle to fail for me to succeed. I didn't need Preston to fall for me to rise. I had already done it, long before the headlines, long before the court dates and confiscated assets and shuttered offices. My success had never been about revenge. It had been about survival. About building something with my own hands when no one offered me tools. About writing a future where I belonged, without needing anyone's permission. I never once fantasized about her coming to me, humbled, ruined, begging for forgiveness or help or acknowledgement. Because even that would have meant giving her space in my story. And I was done giving. Done rewriting myself to fit someone else's narrative. Done softening my voice so it wouldn't make her uncomfortable. Her tragedy wasn't my vindication. It was just her consequence. People asked if I felt justified. If I'd finally gotten what I deserved. But the truth was, I had already gotten it. A life of my own. A home built on love instead of expectation. A name that stood for something because I had made it mean something. Words that were mine. A voice that was heard. A future that was not tethered to a family that had taught me silence, but rather, to the one I had chosen, the people who met me as I was and stayed. Danielle's fall didn't bring me closure. It didn't need to. Because I had already closed the door. And I wasn't looking back. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, wrapped in one of those stiff cream-colored envelopes that feel too formal for anything intimate. It had been forwarded from my publisher's office, tucked beneath a stack of promotional proofs and a note from my assistant asking if I wanted to approve the cover redesign for the next edition. I nearly threw it out without opening it, just another piece of paper, another relic from a life I had outgrown. But something about the handwriting on the front stopped me. Neat, deliberate, hesitant. My name spelled out in a way that felt like someone afraid of writing it too confidently. I opened it slowly, not out of fear, but caution. I'd learned to protect the peace I had built, to not offer myself up to ghosts that hadn't earned their resurrection. Inside was a single sheet of stationery, folded twice, and the moment I saw the slant of the letters, I knew it was hers. My mother had always written with a kind of restrained precision, as if each sentence needed to be approved before it left the pen. But this one felt different. The ink was slightly smudged in places, the pressure uneven. No heading. No date. No opening greeting. Just her words, plain and quiet. She didn't ask for forgiveness. She didn't offer excuses. She didn't mention Daniel or the wedding or the book tours she never congratulated me for. She simply began with what I never thought I would see in her handwriting: "I failed you." The sentence sat alone at the top of the page, stark and unprotected. She wrote that she didn't have a reason good enough to explain the way she treated me, that somewhere along the way, after our father left, she put all her energy into what she could control: Danielle's success, Danielle's path, Danielle's image. She admitted that it had felt easier to mold one daughter than to understand the other. That every time I asked for attention, for recognition, for space, she felt unequipped and overwhelmed, and so she ignored me. Not out of malice, but because facing me meant facing everything she didn't want to admit to herself. She wrote that she had seen the photographs in the press, read the articles about my books, watched a clip of one of my readings online. She said she didn't recognize the woman on stage, confident, graceful, beloved, but that she had felt something crack when she heard my voice. A voice, she said, that she had spent most of my life trying not to hear. And then she wrote it. Not dressed in metaphor. Not buried under vague regrets. Just simply, "I am sorry." It was the only sentence that made my throat tighten. She said she didn't expect a reply. That I owed her nothing. That the apology came too late, and that she knew that. But that she had carried the weight of it for years. And that if nothing else, she hoped I could know, finally, that the fault was hers. That the emptiness I had been made to carry wasn't my punishment. It was her failure. There was no signature. Just her name. Not love, Mom, only Susan, printed at the bottom as if she wasn't sure what she still had the right to call herself in my life. I folded the letter back along its original creases and set it on the windowsill in my office. I didn't cry. I didn't shake. I didn't feel the rush of vindication I had once imagined. It didn't erase anything. It didn't offer repair. But it was real. And that made it heavier than any of the years she spent pretending I didn't hurt. I didn't respond. I didn't reach for my phone or dig through old numbers or open a blank email draft and stare at the blinking cursor. I didn't tell Alexander or Gabriella or Julian. I simply sat with it. The apology, however late, didn't change the ending of that part of my life. But it cracked something open, a door I had sealed so tightly I had almost forgotten it existed. A door that led to a version of myself that had once waited, hoped, ached. And though I didn't step through it, I stood in its quiet shadow for a moment, letting the light from the other side warm the edge of my forgiveness, not given, but considered. And that was enough. The air was cool on my skin, that gentle kind of evening chill Seattle offers just before the sun disappears entirely, sharp enough to notice, soft enough to welcome. I stood on the balcony wrapped in a cotton robe that no longer tied properly at the waist, one hand resting on the gentle rise of my stomach, the other curled around a mug that had long since gone cold. Below, the city pulsed in its usual rhythm, cars weaving through intersections, someone laughing on a nearby patio, the faint hum of music drifting from an open window. But up here, it was quiet. Golden. Whole. I watched the sun lower itself into the edge of the bay, casting long streaks of amber across the horizon, and thought about her. That girl. The one who had fled the mountain lodge with nothing but a clearance-rack dress, a laptop full of invisible words, and a heart too bruised to beat freely. The one who stood in a freezing hostel room and realized, finally, that pretending was more painful than the truth. The one who walked away not in anger, but in exhaustion. She feels so far away now that I can barely remember the sound of her voice when it cracked beneath the weight of another dismissal. And yet she is the reason I am standing here, alive and full and radiant in a way no mirror could ever capture. She would not have believed this life was real. That the words she whispered into blinking cursors would one day be read aloud in bookstores with standing room-only crowds. That the rooms she used to be pushed out of would one day open simply because she knocked. That she would know love, not performative, conditional, sharp-edged love, but real love, the kind that meets you in silence, sees you in your solitude, and stays. I think of her often. Not with pity. Not with shame. With reverence. Because she endured. She kept writing even when no one read. She kept hoping even when every sign told her not to. And now, I write for her. For every version of her that still exists in someone else, a girl in the corner of a family photo, a woman pouring coffee into chipped mugs at dawn, someone who has spent their whole life being useful and never once being seen. I write for the ones who carry stories inside them like lit matches, terrified of striking them for fear the flame might be too small to survive. I write so they know the fire is already there. That it always was. The baby kicked beneath my palm, a small, fluttering pulse against the warmth of my hand, and I exhaled slowly, grounding myself in the moment. I wasn't just writing new stories anymore. I was living one. Every chapter, every quiet morning in our sunlit kitchen, every late-night edit session beside Alexander's soft breathing, every laugh with Gabriella over spilled tea and deadlines missed, was another line I never thought I'd get to write. And in the stillness of this golden hour, I knew it in every cell of my body, I was never the failure. I had always been the future.